They laughed when she walked into the courtroom. "Just another angry veteran," they whispered. The judge sighed as she stood silent in her faded fatigues, refusing to defend herself against the accusations. No one in that room cared to look closer. No one noticed that the woman they mocked as unstable had once been a captain in a special operations unit in Afghanistan. Her squadmates' requests to testify were quietly denied, their stories left untold. In her pocket, she carried a small box holding a silver star engraved for gallantry in action, but not a single person bothered to ask what it meant as she took her seat. Inside, the courtroom's hush was broken by shifting chairs and the scrape of pens, but the focus remained on the woman in fatigues. She stood beside the defendant's table, posture rigid, boots planted on the scuffed floor. Her uniform, faded at the seams, contrasted with the pressed shirts and neat blazers around her. A photo of her in service, silver star ribbon visible on her chest, rested among the evidence, yet no one so much as glanced at it. The public defender, flipping through a thin file, kept his distance, already resigned to the outcome. The prosecutor's words cut through the quiet, his tone carefully measured for the jury. "Just another disgruntled soldier trying to play the veteran card," he said, gesturing at her as though she were a cautionary tale. The jury watched, faces blank. A man in flannel leaned toward his neighbor and muttered, "PTSD, probably." Two others exchanged glances, their verdicts written in their eyes before any testimony began. No one in the room acknowledged her record. No friends or family filled the benches behind her. A clerk, scanning her file, noted the absence of emergency contacts or listed relatives, just another detail lost in the shuffle. The bailiff, fingers tensed near his cuffs, hovered close as if expecting trouble. Her silence and steady gaze only deepened their suspicions. What was discipline to her looked like defiance to them. The town's opinion seeped in quietly. On the prosecutor's table, the county paper's editorial asked, "Women in combat, policy or PR stunt?" The piece quoted politicians and distant experts, never those who had actually served with women. It painted her as a symbol, not a person. The judge, pen tapping in a steady rhythm, barely looked up as the prosecution rested. The defense offered little in response. The air was thick with the smell of old coffee and floor polish, the kind of scent that lingered after too many long days. Outside, a reporter debated whether to bother with a story at all. Through it all, the veteran stood motionless, hands at her sides, eyes fixed on a distant spot. Her left hand brushed the edge of her pocket, feeling the outline of the box she carried. The jury's eyes slid past her, missing the subtle signs. Her even breathing, her squared shoulders signals that meant nothing here. The judge cleared her throat and signaled for the next phase, setting the stage for the accusations to follow. Accusations came in quick succession, each one building on the last. The incident at the VA hospital was first. She'd taken her usual seat, hands folded, eyes alert. When a man arrived late and insisted on being seen before her, she pointed to the posted schedule, voice calm and words exact. He later claimed she tried to intimidate him, that her military bearing felt threatening. Surveillance footage showed her never raising her voice, never leaving her chair, but the story grew in the telling. By the time the statements reached the courtroom, her simple correction had become a tale of aggression. Witnesses filtered their memories through their own expectations. The store clerk remembered aggressive body language, though she hadn't moved. Another described her as cold, almost hostile, her discipline mistaken for anger. The prosecution leaned hard on these impressions, arguing that her military training was not just part of her past, but something she used to control and intimidate. They pointed to her use of precise language, calling it military jargon meant to unsettle civilians. Her silence, her refusal to show emotion, became evidence of a dangerous temperament. Photos of her in uniform, silver star ribbon visible, were projected for the jury. The prosecutor described them as calculated displays, suggesting she wore her service as a shield. They never mentioned the photos were from her last deployment. News outlets picked up the story, running headlines about veterans who couldn't adapt. Commenters online speculated about PTSD, though her records showed no diagnosis. Even in official documents, her service was reduced to a question mark and unknown, a possible liability. Her public defender offered little resistance. He urged her to take a plea, whispering that the jury had already made up their minds. In the gallery, a few faces turned away as the evidence was read. 5 of her former squad mates had written to the court, offering to testify on her behalf. Their statements were dismissed as irrelevant, never reaching the jury. The details that mattered, the ones that could have explained her composure, her habits, remained in sealed envelopes. She sat through it all, silent and unmoved, watching each accusation stack up. The jury saw only what they expected, a veteran out of place, a figure defined by uniform and silence. They never saw the early mornings, the routines, the quiet strength behind her stillness. They looked for emotion and found none, mistaking discipline for danger, never guessing at the life that continued outside the courtroom's walls. Each morning started the same way. Her alarm sounded at 500, and she moved without pause, folding her blanket in tight corners and setting her boots by the door, laces threaded and ready. The routine was quiet and exact, a holdover from years when every detail mattered. She kept her space simple, a drawer with 4 white t-shirts, a single folded flag tucked beneath them. No photos on the walls, no medals in display cases. There was no need. The flag was enough, a silent marker of what she carried and what she'd lost. In the neighborhood, her actions were often overlooked or misunderstood. When a gas main ruptured in the middle of winter, she was the one who moved through the smoke and confusion, guiding 4 elderly residents to safety. The neighbors called it luck. They didn't see the practiced calm, the way she scanned for hazards and cleared the exits before anyone else had even registered the danger. She never explained herself, just nodded when thanked and went back inside. On Thursdays, she volunteered at the animal shelter. The staff noticed she had a way with the most anxious dogs, calming them with the same steady hands she used for field bandages overseas. Her movements were precise, her voice even. The shelter director sometimes wondered how she did it, but never asked. To them, she was just a quiet volunteer who preferred working in the back. Her life was marked by habits most people never noticed. She walked the perimeter of her trailer each night at the same hour, checking locks and latches in a pattern that matched old guard rotations. The local police chief, a former army reservist, once apologized for underestimating her composure after she stepped in to help during a crisis. She accepted the apology with a nod, saying nothing more. She gave what she could, quietly. Every month, an unmarked envelope with 127.5 appeared in the Veterans Food Bank drop box. Receipts for these donations, along with a worn photo of 7 soldiers, sat in a small metal box in her drawer. She never spoke about the night she talked a teenager off the railroad bridge. When the sheriff tried to thank her, she brushed it off and disappeared before anyone could ask questions. These details never made their way into the courtroom. The jury didn't hear about the groceries left on doorsteps during the strike or the kennels rebuilt after a storm. Her discipline and restraint were seen as coldness, her silence mistaken for guilt. What they missed was the strength in the routines, the care in quiet gestures, and the steady presence she brought to every part of her life. As the trial moved forward and questions about her past began to surface, the records that could have filled in the gaps remained out of reach. Requests for her service records hit a wall almost immediately. The defense attorney filed the paperwork weeks before the trial, but the response came back stamped with a vague classification review required. There was no timeline, no further explanation. The prosecutor seized on this, letting the implication hang in the air that she was hiding something. He never mentioned that classified records are common for certain units, or that the process can drag on for months. The jury watched him, picking up on every raised eyebrow. The VA complicated things further. Clerks admitted they had lost a portion of her medical file during a system migration and error that, by their own numbers, affected nearly a third of all veterans' claims. Still, the absence of those records was spun to suggest inconsistency, as if her story changed by the day. The prosecutor pointed to every gap as proof of deception, never acknowledging how often these bureaucratic failures happened. Each missing document became another brick in the wall, separating her from a fair hearing. Media analysts, none of whom had military backgrounds, speculated on air about why her records were delayed. Their commentary rarely addressed the realities of classified service or the frequency of lost paperwork. Instead, they turned the lack of documentation into a story of its own. A popular blog post accused women of exaggerating combat roles for benefits, echoing a familiar skepticism that followed her into the courtroom. The post gathered hundreds of likes before it was quietly removed, but the damage was done. Public opinion shifted, and the story grew legs. Her former squad mates tried to step in, but the court barred them as biased friends. Their statements, first-hand accounts of her actions and character, were never heard. The prosecution's narrative stood unchallenged, and the defense was left with little more than a stack of unanswered requests and a handful of redacted files. A local reporter found her name in an old press release about a special operations unit, but his editor dismissed the story, calling it irrelevant. No one in the courtroom heard about the missions or the commendations that never made it into the official record. The judge instructed the jury to disregard any claims that weren't backed by immediate documentation, leaving the prosecution's insinuations to fill the silence. Through it all, the veteran sat motionless, her eyes fixed ahead as the prosecutor questioned the legitimacy of her service. Her right hand moved in a slow, steady rhythm against the fabric of her pocket, tapping out a pattern that no one recognized. In that room, suspicion grew with every unanswered question, and the weight of missing records pressed down on everyone. But as the trial wore on, small details began to catch the attention of those who were watching closely. A single line of block letters on the veteran's legal pad caught the eye of a juror in the front row. The writing was crisp, evenly spaced, no wasted motion, just like the after-action reports from Afghanistan that a general once described as flawless under fire. Across the aisle, an older man in a VFW cap leaned forward, watching the veteran's posture straight-backed, eyes ahead, every movement deliberate. He seemed to recognize something that others missed. The prosecutor kept circling, waving away any mention of special skills. "All this talk of elite training," he said. "Where's the proof?" His voice filled the room, but the jury's attention had shifted. The veteran's calm never broke. When the judge finally asked why she hadn't spoken up, the room went still. She looked up, her voice steady. "Habits change. Honor doesn't." The words landed with more force than any outburst. The judge ordered a recess, and people filed out. The court clerk lingered, frowning at the latest file from the Defense Department. The classification codes didn't match standard records. They were the kind attached to joint special operations missions, the sort that rarely surfaced in public trials. The clerk flagged the request as priority and sent it up the chain. During the break, the bailiff found the veteran in the holding cell, quietly doing slow, perfect push-ups. She didn't stop when he entered. He stood for a moment, unsure what to say, then left her to her routine. 20 years on the job, and he'd never seen anyone treat a holding cell like a training ground. When the court reconvened, 2 women in dress uniforms entered through the side door. They wore no visible insignia. They stood at parade rest against the back wall, silent, their eyes fixed on the veteran. She straightened unconsciously, shoulders squared, the old reflexes surfacing before she even registered their arrival. It was a reaction shaped by years of protocolar sign of respect and recognition. The clerk's printer came to life, spitting out pages stamped with intelligence seals and codes. The women didn't take seats or approach the defense table. Instead, they waited until the judge returned, then moved forward together. One carried a folder marked with the red tape used for declassified special operations documents. The other nodded once at the veteran, a signal that passed between them without words. As they reached the bench, the courtroom quieted. The folder and a single black and white photograph were placed before the judge. The veteran's hand drifted to her pocket, fingers pressing against the outline of the small metal box she'd carried all this time. The air in the room shifted, everyone waiting for the judge's reaction to what was about to be revealed. A folder landed on the bench, the seals and stamps unmistakable. The judge opened it, her eyes scanning the first page, posture shifting as she registered the details. She turned another page, pausing longer this time. The courtroom, so recently skeptical, watched her expression change in real time. One of the uniformed women slid a photograph forward, an official service portrait, not the faded copy the prosecution had waved around. The veteran stood in dress blues, silver star ribbon visible, nameplate reading, Captain, hair pulled back to regulation. The medals were arranged in careful rows. The jury leaned in, some mouthing the rank, others tracing the outline of the unit patch. The older man in the gallery, VFW cap in hand, drew a slow breath. For the first time, the room saw not a defendant, but a decorated officer. Breaking protocol, the second uniformed woman placed a hand on the veteran's shoulder. The gesture was brief, but it didn't go unnoticed. Even those unfamiliar with military custom sensed the significance. The veteran didn't react outwardly, but her jaw tightened, a sign to those who understood the language of restraint. The prosecutor stood, but his objection died on his lips. He took the document offered by the taller officer, eyes flicking over the words, forward operating base, and medevac under sustained fire. He froze, reading the line. Led extraction of 7 wounded through kill zone. Around him, the jury's assumptions began to shift. The evidence was no longer abstract. It was a record of actions under fire, each detail verified and specific. A short video played on a tablet-grainy, green-tinted helmet cam footage. The veteran, younger but unmistakable, moved through chaos, dragging a wounded soldier to safety. The coordinates flashed, deep inside hostile territory. A voiceover summarized the moment. 936 yards under direct fire. Captain led the team out. Silver Star awarded for gallantry in action against an armed enemy. The engraving on the medal, now open in its box, matched the citation exactly. The judge closed the folder with deliberate care. She didn't gavel the room to order, just announced a recess and left, her steps brisk, eyes down. The prosecutor's notes lay scattered, his arguments undone by facts he could no longer dispute. The uniformed women stood at parade rest behind the veteran, their presence a silent line of defense. In the gallery, the realization spread. The routines, the silence, the discipline unknown of it was what people thought. The veteran sat, as she always had, composed and still, but now every movement was seen differently. The silver star caught the fluorescent light, its inscription clear. Around her, the atmosphere shifted, the story rewritten in a matter of minutes. Outside the courtroom, word began to spread. Reporters refreshed their feeds, unsure of what headline to use. Inside, people started to reconsider what they thought they knew, piecing together the details that had never fit before. The truth emerged with no fanfare, just a shift in the air as the courtroom absorbed what had been hidden in plain sight. The local news site, which had started the morning with a headline about a controversial veteran, updated it twice within the hour. By midday, the lead story read, "Town owes hero an apology." The comment section filled with people admitting they'd misjudged her, some recalling fleeting moments of snowstorm, a helping hand that suddenly felt significant. The man whose accusation had sparked the trial arrived with his lawyer and a paper in his hand. His admission was brief. "I exaggerated what happened," he said, voice unsteady. He avoided looking at the veteran, glancing instead at the 2 officers who stood behind her, their presence a silent warning that the truth was now under guard. The judge listened, nodded, and made a note. The moment was over in seconds, but it marked a reversal that no one could ignore. Her squad mates gave their testimony next. They spoke plainly about the night in Kunar province. She had led them through darkness and chaos, pulling 2 wounded soldiers to safety when the radios failed, patching a femoral artery while calling in coordinates. 7 lives saved, including a lieutenant who would go on to speak for the Pentagon. The jury listened, silent, as the story unfolded, every detail matching the citations, the photographs, the medal itself. The prosecutor, who had spent days building a case on suspicion, sat back and said nothing. The small metal box in her pocket held more than just the silver star. There were photograph zones showing her team around a camp stove, another in dress uniforms, a third with faces marked out, and one of her shaking hands with a general whose face was familiar from television. These images, passed quietly to the judge, spoke for her in ways she never would. Letters began to arrive from military bases across the country, filling her mailbox and the courthouse alike. Some were from women in uniform, others from men who recognized her name from old reports. The outpouring was steady, a tide of respect replacing the whispers that had followed her for months. When the judge removed the monitoring bracelet herself, the act was quiet but unmistakable. She murmured, "I had no idea," and stepped back. The prosecutor tried to offer an apology, but the veteran only nodded once, retrieving her jacket without a word. The jury forewoman wiped her eyes, the weight of the story settling over the room. Others sat in stunned silence, reviewing service records and photographs that had changed everything. The veteran gathered her things, tucking the box and medal away, and walked out between her fellow soldiers. She kept her head high, her stride steady. This time, people stepped aside, not out of suspicion, but out of respect. As the doors closed behind her, the courthouse emptied, leaving behind a new understanding and the memory of a quiet heroism that needed no explanation. After the trial, the noise faded quickly. Most reporters lost interest once the story no longer fit the narrative they'd built. The only correction came in the local paper, a brief notice buried on the bottom of page 7, time-stamped 4:17 a.m. It mentioned allegations made in error, never using her name, never offering more than a line before moving on to summer events and classifieds. The town read it, or didn't. The truth was there for anyone willing to look. The town council, perhaps feeling the weight of their earlier silence, voted to include her in the Memorial Day parade. For the first time, her name appeared in bold on the program, listed with her rank and silver star. No photo, just a silhouette in place of her face. The invitation arrived on official stationery, but she left it unopened on the kitchen table, next to a cold cup of coffee. Still, when the parade rolled down Main Street, her name was read aloud, and the crowd paused longer than usual. Some people clapped, some just stood quietly. It was the kind of gesture that tried to make up for old mistakes, even if it came late. At the VA, her case was reassigned. She now met with a counselor who had clearance for special operations cases, someone who understood what didn't need to be said. Their sessions were short. He didn't ask her to relive things for paperwork or fit her into a checklist. He listened, trusted her word, and let silence fill the gaps where answers never came easy. A mailbox appeared outside her trailer for the first time in years. Within weeks, it overflowed with letters, most from women in uniform, some from men, all written in careful script. One envelope held a photograph of a young woman in fatigues beside a helicopter with a note, "Because of you, I tried." The letters kept coming, postmarked from bases across the country, sometimes from overseas. They filled the gaps left by old rumors, each one a small act of recognition. The dawn walks continued. She kept the same route, boots on wet pavement, hands in her pockets. But now, when she passed the bait shop, the owner raised his coffee in salute. The JROTC instructor started bringing cadets to the sidewalk at sunrise. They stood at attention until she'd passed. Neighbors who once looked away now nodded, some even stopping to thank her. The air shifted, no more suspicion, just quiet respect. Inside her trailer, the folded flag that had always been tucked away finally found its place on the wall, framed in plain oak. She added a small brass plaque beneath it, engraved with 7 initials. It was a private gesture, honoring those lost, but now it hung where anyone could see. The flag no longer marked only absence, it marked a kind of belonging. Morning after morning, she kept her rituals. She answered few letters, spoke to even fewer people. But every so often, as the sun broke the horizon, she would pause and return a salute. The gestures were simple, almost invisible, but they changed the shape of her days and the way the town saw her. Some stories end with a headline, others with a parade. But the real change settles in quietly, where people start to notice not just the silence, but what it means. Valor rarely asks for attention, The silver star she earned sits quietly in its case, tucked away where only she knows. Her story reminds us how quickly people judge what they do not understand, and how often true courage escapes notice because it does not seek it. She never asked for applause, and she never waited for it. Her actions, shaped by duty and discipline, speak for themselves whether anyone is watching or not. If you know someone whose story deserves to be heard, someone who served with quiet honor, share their name or experience in the comments below. Her medal still rests hidden because real courage never demands a spotlight.